Hello students of Political Psychology 3101. This is our first lecture, our first of numerous lectures. This may be a bit longer than what I normally will do. I'll try to keep them as brief as possible. What I don't want you to do is kind of like race through them by turning me into a munchkin. I hear that's a popular thing for students to do. I've even explored it in myself. It is kind of funny when you try to double speed through the through the content, and so please try not to do that. But I can't stop you from doing it anyway. But anyway, let's cut to the chase, because I would like to keep the video presentations on the briefer side, meaning that I will try very hard not to exceed 25 minutes. This one will probably be somewhere around that, or maybe even a little bit longer. Okay, so just bear with me. Okay, so anyway, kind of like more formally, what is psychology? Okay, it's the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. I put that out there because, after all, this is a political psychology course, right? So we're merging two terms, politics and psychology. So I got to define psychology for you. Now, political psychology, however, is within the broader context of psychology as a field, and we're not going to go back into the intro psych stuff, which everyone had to take in order to get into a class such as this one. Political psychology is a relatively, I say relatively new academic field that combines the political science with psychology. But I want to, again, give you the caveat that this is not a political science course, that we will be looking at things through the lens of psychology. And maybe some of that, when we look at some of the historical antecedents of what has come to become political psychology, maybe you'll get a feel for it. And maybe also in my discussion of some of the historical aspects of it, you'll kind of like almost get a contemporary feel for, kind of like where we are, given the sharp division between, say, conservatism versus progressivism. I'm not using the term liberal. I kind of abhor the term, but I prefer the word progressivism because I think it more sharply defines exactly what underlies the thinking of progressives. But more on that later. Okay, but let's talk about political science. What is it? It's a social science discipline that's concerned with the study of state, government, and politics. What is politics, you ask? The art or science of influencing people's belief on a civic or individual level when there are two or more people involved. Modern political discourse focuses on democracy and relationship between people and politics. Thus, political psychology is, at its very least, a good marriage between these two disciplines. Some observations about political psychology as a subspecialism. One, as I've already alluded to, it's a relatively newly recognized field, although early pioneers like Harold Lassel's, and this is like in the 1920s, studied modern influence of psychology on politics. The courses on it were not offered until the early 70s, however. In 1977, the Society for Political Psychology, the ISPP, was established, and the journal Political Psychology was founded in 1979. If you're curious, its web address is www.ispp.org. I'm pretty sure it's still a very valid link. Political psychology is international in focus, and although dominated by American scholars, it is becoming increasingly popular in Europe and other parts of the world. It is a genuinely international enterprise today. From the perspective of the political world, this view is ultimately based on a view of human nature and consequently a view of human psychology. Niccolò Machiavelli and the Prince comes to mind. Does anyone recall Machiavelli and what he said? And what was his view of human nature? Briefly, Niccolò Niccolò Machiavelli was an Italian historian, politician, diplomat, and writer. He was based in Florence during the Renaissance period, and for many years he was an official in the Florentine Republic with responsibilities in diplomatic and military affairs. He was a founder of modern political science, and more specifically, political ethics. Now, here's some things that he said. Oh, by the way, anyone ever hear of The Prince? Because he wrote that. I see all the hands going up, right? You recognize that. Anyway, even if you don't. But it's pretty interesting on some of the things that came out of that treatise. Here are some of the things that Machiavelli said. So kind of like try and process this. No enterprise is more likely to succeed than one concealed from the enemy until it is ripe for execution. No enterprise is more likely to succeed than one concealed from the enemy until it is ripe for execution. It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. If an injury has to be done to a man, it should be so severe that his vengeance need not be feared. And no, I'm not quoting Donald Trump. Politics have no relations to morals. Again, I'm not quoting Donald Trump. When you disarm the people, you commence to offend them and show that you distrust them, either through cowardice or lack of confidence, and both of these opinions generate hatred. Ah, Machiavelli sounds like a bad guy, or maybe he doesn't. But it's very, very clear that Machiavelli was talking about something very psychological. Now let's contrast that with the view of those of John Locke, Hobbes. Historically, we call them the British empiricists, because they had juxtaposed, contrasting views themselves. Here are some of the things that they said. We are like chameleons. We take our hue and the color of our moral character from those who are around us. All mankind being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. An excellent man, like precious metal, is in every way invariable. Now, said excellent man, you have to understand the context of the time. Of course, more contemporary context of the same thing might be excellent person, right? Because that would be more politically correct, and rightfully so. But at that time, man was sort of like used collectively for humans. How about this one? A sound mind and a sound body is a short but full description of a happy state in this world. He that has two of these has little more to wish for, and he that wants either of them will be little the better for anything else. You kind of like get the gist. One particular intellectual view was, Machiavellian view, was psychologically pessimistic and dark. And the other, the British empiricist view, quite the opposite, reflecting malleability in an individual. In one particular case, a dark side, perhaps innately driven, and then a more positive side, more potentially externally driven, as you play back some of the things that I've just described to you. Maybe you can get the gist of the general optimism that is in some of those statements that came from the British empiricists. And by the way, the British empiricist thinking, and John Locke in particular, heavily influenced the U.S. Constitution, including psychology as well. Well, you know, John Locke is called the father of classical liberalism, and a lot of his ideas were embodied in the writings of Benjamin Franklin, Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, the whole notion of religious tolerance. Story has it that Benjamin Franklin could be seen walking around with a copy of John Locke's book under his arm. Whether that's true or not, I'm not sure. It's something that we have heard over the years. Anyway, so obviously political psychology is influenced by psychology, generally not the other way around, right? Okay. Now, getting into how political psychology has evolved, there were basically three broad phases, and they kind of relate to what we're going to cover through the rest of this semester. We can call them three broad phases. And the first one being the era of personality studies, which took place in the 40s and in the 50s. And it was largely dominated by psychodynamic theory. I don't have to get into that stuff. If you've taken any courses in clinical psychology or personality psychology, psychodynamic theory was largely promulgated by Freud. Not just Freud, it was also Alfred Adler and Carl Jung. They largely had unconscious process models to explain human personality. And since this isn't a personality course, we're not going to get into that here. But we may cycle back to some personality attributes, because at some point in the semester you're going to be taking personality scales, the 5-factor scales, because political psychologists want to know whether patterns of personality traits are predictive of political orientation. It's a really interesting approach, and borrows very heavily from a lot of the trait theories that were developed. Some of them, in fact, in the 30s and the 40s, and then and then also leading into the 40s and the 50s. And I'm thinking of Eysenck, E-Y-S-E-N-C-K, I think is the spelling of his name, as being part of that. But anyway, that was one big phase influencing political psychology. Another one, which took place in the 60s and the 70s, was the era of political attitudes and voting behavior studies. And there were a lot of measurements of attitudes, right? Attitude versus opinion. Like, what is the difference between an attitude and an opinion? Large-scale survey research, replacing psychobiography or psychological profiling, looked at attitude consistency, and also tried to explore things within the model of cognitive dissonance. What is it? Cognitive dissonance? Maybe some of you have heard of it. It was the concept was developed by Leon Festinger, and contributions of what was developing at the time called dissonance theory, and essentially cognitive dissonance kind of like describes the tendency for us to reorient our attitude to make them consistent with behaviors that may apparently contradict the attitude that we thought we had. And we're going to explore that a little bit later as well, because some think that that cognitive dissonance theory is a good model from which we can explain contemporary political orientations. Anyway, so much for that. But the third big influence, this is like in the 80s and the 90s, and for some of you, the 90s may seem like such a long time ago. Or wait, some maybe you weren't even born in the 90s. It doesn't seem like such a long time ago for me, to be honest. But anyway, in the 80s and the 90s, we were focusing on political beliefs. And we also ported over a lot of social psychological concepts and cognitive psychological concepts, including the application of information processing models and the decision making that went into it. We're going to explore a little bit more of that a little bit later. Information processing and decision making and exposure forms you might say, the underbelly of propaganda and its effectiveness, something we are going to explore later on. Anyway, But this particular approach, that is information processing, decision making, emphasizes the content of people's knowledge structures in shaping decision making and behavior. And as it turns out, is most influential. Decisions are based on limited capacity to process incoming information. In other words, the model says you have limited cognitive capacity. You can't process everything, nor can you remember everything, and you already know that, right? What we've learned is that memory is a reconstructive process, not a playback of recordings. And we use something like memory heuristics, schemas, to explain our memory or the things that that we recall. Okay. Let me describe for you one concept that came out of a lot of the work that the cognitive perspective and the information processing approach had contributed to political psychological discourse, and that is the concept of bounded rationality. And we believe it's a realistic account of human decision making and describes satisficing behavior quite accurately. We kind of like to think of ourselves as very solid logical decision makers, but bounded rationality says that we simply are not. We are human decision makers. We are rational, but only within the bounds of the information that's available to us. Satisfice occurs when we go for the first available option that will do out of a limitless set of choices. Quite simply, we're going to explore that a little bit, a little bit more later, but it is an interesting concept. Anyway, another one is analogical reasoning. And what that is we use past situations in order to understand the present and predict the future. While that seems to make a lot of sense from the point of from the political point of view, many disastrous decisions have been made because of our natural tendency to use analogical reasoning. Okay, and essentially, analogical reasoning seems to be the dominant cognitive approach when we are faced with very, very uncertain situations, and decision makers end up relying on historical analogies in order to help them. But other areas of interest from a political psychological point of view are what are political beliefs, thoughts and feelings associated with them. Take for example attitudes, opinions, belief about abortion, and but let me also point out that the psychological perspective that I'm describing here is from a lot of political scientists' perspective and others, not the only one. Some really believe in the rational choice perspective. It is a popular non-psychological rational choice. The argument is that popular non-psychological rational choice contributes to political behavior. Okay. Summarily, we can call them Homo economicus, as opposed to what I'm describing to you as Homo psychologicus model. The Homo economicus model is that people are fully rational, possess perfect information, and it derives from microeconomic theory, maximizes subjective utility and weighs up the costs and the benefits of actions, and we select options that deliver greatest benefits relative to both. Does that sound like something that it would describe you? Maybe you think it does. But if that just somehow doesn't resonate as an accurate description of how you really approach things, whether it's political or whether it's not political, then you're getting what I mean. The other perspective, the Homo psychologicus, basically says that bounded rational actors do not, and in fact cannot, possess perfect information. And that is because they have limited processing abilities. And the concept is derived from social and cognitive psychology, which, as you see, when we deconstruct it, we go to other areas like Stanley Milgram and Philip Zimbardo and etc. It basically says that we employ heuristics and shortcuts to manage information overload. And this guides our political decision making. Group and broader social pressures lead actors to behave in very non-rational ways, contrary to his or her beliefs and values. How many of you have heard the concept of the invisible hand of economics? Okay. I think that the invisible hand is essentially a natural phenomena that guides free markets and capitalisms through competition for scarce resources. No, I think the invisible hand is, in fact, the psychological processes that I've been alluding to. Anyway, I'm looking at my clock timer over here, and it looks like we are 18 minutes and 34 seconds and still counting. And I think I've covered all I really need to do in this section. Look for my next lecture. It's going to be on. It's going to be around the middle of the week. I'm going to post it, but I'm also going to put the first essay question up, and it's largely going to be about finding political ads to touch on some of the concepts of behaviorism, applying the associative learning models. I'll get to that in my next lecture, and like I said, I'm going to put that video lecture up as we start out the week. So again, welcome to the class, and please reach out to me if you have any issues or if you have any questions. I'm assuming everyone knows, the direction of the course because you've explored the syllable. And let's go out and let's just have a lot of fun. Okay? All right. Ciao for now.